name's Mio Kobayashi-Frisk. I am a PhD student at the University of Gothenburg and a resident physician in psychiatry at the Sahlgrenska University Hospital. And I'm joining you today from Gothenburg, Sweden, to talk a little bit about our recently published paper on comorbid insomnia and sleep apnea. So our paper was published in the Annals of the American Thoracic Society and is titled Comorbid Insomnia and Sleep Apnea, or COMISA, is associated with uncontrolled hypertension in a middle-aged population. So let's take a look at the burden of these disorders, starting with OSA. It affects up to 1 billion people worldwide, and it's associated with a whole host of negative health consequences, including cardiovascular diseases and hypertension. It's one of the main culprits behind resistant hypertension. Insomnia is also another extremely prevalent sleep disorder. If we look at the symptoms, which would be difficulties falling asleep, difficulties maintaining sleep, and poor quality of sleep, up to 50% of the adult population suffers from this, and it's associated with very many negative health outcomes, including hypertension. And just as a reminder as to why we are so concerned about uncontrolled blood pressure or too high blood pressure is because it ultimately leads to hypertension-mediated organ damage. And as we can see in this figure that I've borrowed from the European Society of Cardiology, it affects pretty much every organ system in the body, which is why blood pressure is so central to our health. So both OSA and insomnia are associated with hypertension and other negative health outcomes. What does it look like if both are combined? We think that maybe this might be associated with an increase in uncontrolled hypertension. So to answer this question, we turn to a population-based cohort, specifically the Swedish Cardiopulmonary Bioimage Study, or SCOPIS, and we looked at the Gothenburg cohort. And here are some characteristics of that cohort. There were just under 4,000 participants with a pretty even distribution between males and females, and they were middle-aged, between 50 and 64 years old, and they were randomly recruited from the population registry. And there was a lot of information collected about these participants with imaging, functional testing, blood sampling, questionnaires, and anthropometric measurements. Blood pressure was measured at an office visit and categorized into 3 different groups: normotensive, controlled hypertension, and uncontrolled hypertension, as defined by the European Society of Cardiology. Breathing during sleep was measured with a home polygraph recording, and an AHI, or apnea-hypopnea index, of over 10 events per hour was considered obstructive sleep apnea. And insomnia was determined by a questionnaire, the Insomnia Severity Index, or ISI, and an ISI greater than or equal to 15 was considered insomnia. And because the SCOPIS study mapped the participants so thoroughly, we were able to control for very many different potential confounding factors in our analyses. So first, let's look a little bit at some prevalence numbers. In the Gothenburg cohort of middle-aged participants, 20% about had OSA, and of them, about 15% also had insomnia, and just under 15% had insomnia, and of them, about a little over 20% had OSA as well. And if we look at the prevalence graphically like this, we see that about 3% had COMISA. So here are some characteristics of each of the 4 groups. And I just wanted to bring your attention to the gender difference. Insomnia seems to be female dominant, OSA male dominant, and COMISA somewhere in between. If we look at BMI, COMISA has the highest BMI, followed by OSA. And if we look at respiratory markers, AHI does not differ between OSA and the COMISA group. And ODI is slightly higher among those with COMISA, but this was not statistically significant. But on the other hand, T90, or the time spent with an oxygen saturation equal to or below 90%, was significantly higher among the COMISA group compared to the OSA group. Obviously, the others are going to have lower respiratory markers here because they do not have sleep-disordered breathing. And then in terms of sleepiness, COMISA participants are sleepier than those with only OSA, and actually even a little bit sleepier than those with insomnia only. And just to illustrate a little bit, here I've compared the group that has just OSA and those with COMISA in terms of these characteristics. So, jumping to the relationship between COMISA and hypertension, we see that there is pretty much a dose-dependent response here in terms of both prevalence of controlled and uncontrolled hypertension as we go from participants who have neither sleep disorder to those who have only insomnia, to those who have just OSA, to those who have COMISA. And this was significant in a chi-square test, and there is even a significant difference between those who have just OSA and COMISA. And if we control for the confounders that I've listed previously, we see that there is a increased risk for both controlled and uncontrolled hypertension in those with OSA only, a 31% increase in odds, and then an 88% increase in odds for those who have COMISA. We did a similar analysis combining OSA and excessive daytime sleepiness and the risk of hypertension, and this is what we found. There was no difference between those with only OSA and those that were sleepy and had OSA. And if we look at a logistic regression, we found that there was actually an increase in risk of hypertension for those who had only OSA with a 41% increase in odds, but no significant increased risk of hypertension among those who were sleepy and had OSA compared to those who had neither OSA nor sleepiness. We have established then that there is a relationship between sleep disorder status and hypertension, both controlled and uncontrolled actually, and we wanted to understand if there was something else we could measure that was a mediator for this relationship. And we found that T90, or recording time with a saturation or oxygen saturation below or equal to 90%, was a partial mediator in this relationship. We can only speculate as to the mechanism behind this, but we think that T90 is a measure of hypoxic exposure, and this could lead to sympathetic activation, inflammatory response, and or endothelial dysfunction, which then ultimately could lead to hypertension. So just to summarize our main results, we found in our population-based cohort that insomnia is prevalent among those with obstructive sleep apnea and vice versa, and that excessive daytime sleepiness overlaps with COMISA, and that COMISA is associated with a 90% increased odds of uncontrolled hypertension, and that the relationship between sleep disorder and hypertensive status is partially mediated by hypoxic exposure. And finally, for some key take-home points that I think we should be walking away with from this study, first off, maybe we should be screening for OSA and insomnia among patients who have either sleep disorder because they seem to commonly co-occur. And we need to consider precision medicine in sleep apnea management. Maybe if the patient in front of us also has insomnia, they need to be extra motivated to treat their sleep disordered breathing and their insomnia at that, and also maybe be more aggressive with the primary prevention to get that blood pressure down and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Finally, in general, maybe we should be considering sleep health more as a multidimensional construct. It's not just about one sleep disorder or one type of problem with sleep. Usually someone who has problems with sleep has problems with multiple aspects of their sleep that need to be addressed. Yes, and that was it for me. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.